Lori and Larry got to know each other after they both had a few failed marriages and several children behind them. However, over the years, they managed to bring along a wonderful sense of love, and on the morning of February 13th, right before Valentine's Day, they had a romantic date, which cost one of them their life. Larry and Lori Eisenberg had just returned from Idaho, where the man had ticked a few items off his bucket list. He wanted to watch the shuttle launch, ride a fan boat, and learn sailing. On the cold morning of February 13, 2018, Larry, aged 68, and his wife Lori, aged 64, woke up early to watch the sunrise. They took their motorboat out into the calm waters of Lake Coeur d'Alene in Idaho to enjoy the first rays of sun at a picturesque spot called Sam Bay before driving to breakfast at an exclusive resort. Unfortunately, these wishes were not fulfilled. Just a few hours later, at 10:25 a.m., the sheriff's office of Kootenai County received a distress call. The woman's voice broke into a scream. She was choking on sobs, but as she calmed down a bit, she was able to explain to the emergency operator what had happened. Larry and Lori Eisenberg had been together for 17 years. Each of them had several children from previous relationships, but still, they never argued and always looked for reasons to praise each other. Relatives and friends spoke of them as a wonderful couple that could carry its love over the years. On the eve of Valentine's Day, the man was in a romantic mood, considering every day as the most beautiful of his life, always appearing everywhere with a smile on his face. That morning, Larry sent his daughter a photo of the sunrise before his departure and wrote to a friend that the fishing trip was canceled because he felt a bit unwell. The Eisenbergs boarded the boat. Larry started the engine, and the boat gently rocked them towards the sun on the water. They were quite far from the shore when the engine suddenly went out. The man went to the bow of the ship to see what had happened with the engine when suddenly Larry felt dizzy and fell overboard into the icy water. Lori, who had not expected such an event, panicked and rushed to help him, but she tripped, fell, and hit her head on something, causing her nose to bleed. When she stood up, her husband was nowhere to be found. He had apparently disappeared into the dark water. Attempts to find the mobile phone were unsuccessful. Then Lori tried to start the engine, but as Larry fell, he apparently broke the ignition switch, and she had to start the engine manually. The desperate woman circled the spot where her husband had fallen into the water. As she looked into the lake's mirror surface, desperately trying to find him, she was afraid to continue swimming or to return to shore for fear of losing orientation. She even honked the boat's horn several times to attract someone's attention. When Lori realized it was all in vain, she first felt cold all over her body. She took out the blanket and saw her husband's mobile phone as she called the rescue service. About 2 hours had passed since Larry disappeared into the icy water. After the call, Lori hopelessly let her hand sink, and the phone slipped overboard. Shortly after 11 a.m., officers at the nearby coast dispatched a rescue boat to bring the distressed woman to land for medical treatment, while the Eisenbergs' boat was towed for further investigation. Although at first glance everything seemed like a tragic accident, the police had to ensure there were no indications of a crime. Larry was likely already dead after more than 2 hours in the water. Survival under such harsh conditions is nearly impossible. Now it was necessary to reproduce a detailed picture of the incident and verify the truthfulness of the woman's words. Upon boarding the ship, investigators immediately noticed blood splatters in several places, likely due to the woman's nosebleed. Although Lori's statement that the ignition switch was defective just before Larry went underwater, the police found a switch, and the rope on the floor seemed odd to the investigators because, for the engine to start, the switch and belt must be attached to the ignition lock. Moreover, the ignition key was significantly bent, indicating a possible struggle. They also searched Lori's pockets. In her handbags, there were several keys and an empty juice bottle. All items were seized as evidence, and the boat was taken to a nearby parking lot for storage. The truck that towed the Eisenbergs' boat was also inspected, but nothing special was found. One of the officers noticed Lori's lost mobile phone and a bottle of allergy medication on the center console. It was an over-the-counter drug. The search for Larry Eisenberg in the water was complicated by the fact that he wore dark clothing, and Lori did not know exactly where the boat was when the man went overboard. Therefore, the search area was significantly expanded. Instead of a rescue diver, a decision was made to use an acoustic group. Search and rescue helicopters also flew over the lake, hoping to find the body of the drowned man, but to no avail. On the first day, the sonar rescue team spent 3.5 hours searching for Larry in the cold water of the lake. Experts searched for the body until it became too dark to see anything. Meanwhile, one of the officers met with Lori Eisenberg at the hospital where the woman had been taken after the incident. He wanted to determine a more precise search area, so he showed her a map of the lake and asked her to tell him again how Larry fell into the water and what exactly happened with the boat's engine. Lori said that after a walk by the lake, she started saying something about the resort they wanted to go to. Initially, he had planned to go fishing in the morning, but his health deteriorated in the morning, so they simply decided to enjoy the morning and have breakfast at the resort. At that moment, the engine went out, and Larry went to see what the problem was. Lori herself stayed inside and watched through the glass what her husband was doing. Suddenly, he turned around, became pale, and began to fall to the side. Apparently, he supported himself on the key at the moment of the fall, and it bent in the ignition lock. The woman thought something was wrong with his heart and rushed to help him. If she had not tripped at the most inopportune moment, Larry might still have been alive. Lori covered her face with her hands and was silent for a while, only her shoulders trembling with silent sobs. A few minutes later, she ran her finger over the map, but could not determine the exact location of the tragedy. Her thoughts were confused, and she could not remember whether there were trees or houses nearby, from which side the sun was shining. She even lost her sense of time as she searched for her husband in the water. In such situations, a minute can seem like an eternity. Due to the great depth of the lake and the low water temperature, the search for the body was very difficult. First, the sonar team had to find the drowned person, and then with the help of rescue divers, lift the body to the surface. Since efforts to find Larry were still unsuccessful, investigators called Lori on February 18th, 5 days after the tragedy, and asked her to accompany the sonar group to the lake. However, the presence of the woman was only a nuisance. She still could not remember any concrete landmarks. The lack of any information about the location seemed strange to the investigators, but Eisenberg's behavior surprised them even more. During the search work, Lori joked, laughed irrelevantly, and then suddenly began to sob as if she remembered why she was invited to the lake. Not enough time had passed since the death of a loved one, and Lori apparently could not come to terms with the thought that her husband was no longer alive and now felt guilty because she had shown positive feelings. Our paradise, that's what the Eisenbergs called their home. After her husband's death, Lori could no longer stay in the house where they had lived happily for 17 years. When the woman returned from the lake that day, she began to actively prepare the residence of Larry and Lori, located 20 minutes southwest of the city. The woman invited her relatives to help move all the things and furniture out of the house because she wanted to sell it as quickly as possible. Vigilant neighbors reported this to the police. It seemed to them that the woman was behaving somehow strangely and suspiciously. Lori Eisenberg was proud to have worked for the North Idaho Housing Coalition for many years, and recently the chief accountant of this institution ordered an internal audit because he noticed some violations. Many employees suspected that something illegal was going on in the coalition, but when the truth came to light, all employees were literally stunned. This shocking revelation aroused the interest of investigators and gave the investigations a completely new direction. Lori Eisenberg was suspected of possible fraudulent activity related to the theft of coalition funds, amounting to $500,000. The woman was suspended and threatened with dismissal. Everyone who knew her could not believe what happened. Lori had no criminal record, and she and her husband were not poor. All these accusations seemed like some kind of monstrous mistake. Since Lars' children sensed that something was wrong, they asked for permission to speak to the investigators about their concerns. They expressed concerns about going to the lake at this time of year. Moreover, their father did not go fishing because he was feeling unwell. Then Dean, Larry's son, spoke about Lori's strange behavior in the days following her father's disappearance. She asked how they would divide the inheritance. Dee was very concerned about his father's death, so he just left without even talking about this topic. It seemed premature to him since his father's body had not yet been found. To somehow reassure the relatives of the deceased, the detective explained how the search was conducted. The sonar group first checked the area of highest probability, but if this does not yield results, they scan the water diagonally in different directions. After Larry's family left, the investigators discussed all the details of the case again. Although Eisenberg's wife was not among the suspects, her behavior in general raised doubts. She could calmly answer all the investigators' questions and explain all the details, but something about the investigation bothered the investigators. The next day, a search was conducted at the Eisenberg house in connection with Lori's fraud allegations, and on February 27th, the woman was arrested for 40 cases of forgery and severe theft at the non-profit North Idaho Housing Coalition, where she had previously worked as an executive director. Her bail was set at $75,000, which was immediately posted by one of her daughters. However, a shocking discovery happened literally a day later, on March 1st, 2018. Weeks after Larry Eisenberg suddenly fell from his boat into the icy waters of Lake Coeur d'Alene, the body of a man floating face down near the coast was found about 5 kilometers from the accident site indicated by his wife. No suspicious injuries were found on the body, and based on the clothing of the drowned man, it was likely that the search was ultimately successful. The body was pulled from the water and sent for further examination. An autopsy confirmed that it was Larry Eisenberg, but the medical examiner also found out the cause of death. It turned out that Larry did not die in the water since no signs of drowning were found. Toxicological tests revealed lethal concentrations of an antihistamine in his body, which is used to combat allergies and suppress some cold symptoms. This drug acts very quickly but can only be fatal in rare cases if too much is taken in a short time. Larry's antihistamine dose exceeded the norm by 70 times, so according to the medical examiner, Eisenberg died before he fell into the water. The authorities decided not to release the autopsy results immediately. In an earlier statement to the police, Lori mentioned that her husband took a variety of pills every day, then forgot and took them again, often confusing the dosages. It is possible that the woman told the absolute truth, but it is also possible that she gave this information in advance in case the body was found and a lethal dose of drugs was discovered in the body. Lori also insisted that Larry had not been quite healthy lately and had complained of malaise. However, all other relatives unanimously assured the opposite. The only time Eisenberg mentioned his illness was in a text message to a friend on the morning before his disappearance, provided he sent the text himself. An experienced analyst found that Larry's phone was last used near the house of Lori's son after Eisenberg's disappearance. Although the woman claimed she had thrown the mobile phone into the water immediately after calling the rescue service, Lori could not explain how the phone could have been used afterwards. Also, her son from a previous marriage swore and swore that he had never held Larry's mobile phone in his hand. At the end of May, Lori did not appear for the hearing in the fraud case. As it turned out, the woman was trying to avoid punishment. Eisenberg quickly fled the region and was on the run for about 2 months before surrendering to the authorities in July. Detectives who were working on the case of the mysterious death of Larry Eisenberg at the time interrogated colleagues and acquaintances of the deceased. They learned that the first cracks appeared in the couple's ideal relationship. Although Lori and seemed to be a happy couple, the man often complained to his friends in recent months about his wife's excessive spending. He did not like that a large part of their joint savings went to support Lori's children, who had long been independent adults. The investigators also learned that Lori was a rather frivolous woman. She easily cheated on her first husband with 3 different men, including Eisenberg. Although this was in the past, it still did not provide a particularly flattering description of Larry's wife. The topic of betrayal was also raised on the board of the Housing Coalition. However, the next discovery could serve as a concrete motive for the crime. Investigators discovered changes to Larry's will made by none other than Lori. The handwritten changes were made about a month before his death. According to the new will, it turned out that 80% of the inheritance went not to his own children but to 6 stepdaughters, Lori Eisenberg's daughters from another marriage. It is not known what the woman expected when she made these changes. Finally, the authorities released the autopsy results and called this case a comprehensive investigation of a particularly serious crime in which a person died. The investigators even spoke with a doctor who said that Larry was absolutely healthy for his age. He was never prescribed a drug that later ended fatally. Based on all the collected evidence, the police assumed that Lori mixed an excessive dose of medication into the juice bottle. Larry drank the contents and fell under the effect of the toxic drug not far from the shore where he was found overboard. Lori immediately used a trolling motor to move the boat away from the area before calling 911. None of the spouses seemed to have life insurance, which is often a motive for such crimes. However, investigators learned that there was an agreement between the spouses that if one of them died, the other would become the owner of the joint property. Lori planned to use the money to repay the housing coalition. At the time of his death, Larry did not know that his wife was involved in fraud at her workplace and did all this to help her daughters financially. At least that's what she told her children. 2 months later, in July 2018, Lori was tired of hiding because she knew they would find her sooner or later anyway. She contacted the sheriff's office herself, saying she was simply living with her family in California. In early 2019, Lori and her 4 daughters admitted to fraud with the use of electronic communication devices and pleaded guilty to the charges. Lori Eisenberg was sentenced to 5 years in prison, and her daughters received 3 years probation and several hours of community service, as well as a fine of more than $50,000. While Lori was in prison for fraud, the investigation into the strange death of her husband continued. Investigators checked the search history on the woman's phone and found incriminating evidence. While Larry was enjoying their joint trip to Florida, Lori studied depth charts and articles about drownings and boating accidents. Finally, Lori was charged in February 2020, while she was still in federal prison for fraud and embezzlement, with the intentional death of her husband, Larry Eisenberg. Lori, 67, appeared in court in May 2021 for the verdict. She denied until the last that the crime was planned and tried to present everything as an accident. However, the jury did not believe the woman, and Lori Eisenberg was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole only after 30 years. Whether the daughters of a selfish woman are involved in the story of a man's death will remain a mystery forever. A glamorous businesswoman with a huge bank account longing for companionship, an anesthetist with a charming smile who dreamed of his queen. A whirlwind of passion caught them at their first encounter, but not everyone was happy to see the joy in their love-struck eyes. The main character of our story today is Debra Newell. Debra is very stylish, successful, and very wealthy. Yet millions didn't just fall from the sky. To achieve financial independence, she had to work hard. She spent years in interior design and reached incredible heights. Eventually, Debra founded her own design company named Ambrosia and dedicated 30 years to this business. Debra loved her work, but there wasn't much true love in her life. She was married 4 times, but all marriages ended in divorce. She had 4 children and was a wonderful mother, but somehow, things never worked out with men. There came a time when her future was secured for the coming decades. She longed for simple feminine happiness. A few years ago, a tragedy in Debra's family changed her life. In March 1984, her brother-in-law, Billy Wickers, murdered her older sister, Cindy. During the trial, Cindy's and Debra's mother sided with Billy and testified against her own daughter. Eventually, Wickers received a very short prison sentence and spent only a few years behind bars for such a terrible crime. Cindy and Billy had 2 children. This tragedy left deep scars in their hearts. After this incident, Debra became very nervous and was panic-stricken at the thought of firearms. Many friends advised her to buy a gun because she lived alone for a long time. but she couldn't physically stand to have a weapon near her. Debra preferred to be surrounded by beautiful things and always present herself well. She spent a lot of time and money on her hair, makeup, and skincare. She had many designer items like Gucci shoes, Cartier jeans, and Chanel diamonds. At this point in her life, the only thing missing was a loving man by her side. The second protagonist of this story, John Meehan, was born in February 1958 in California and grew up with his sisters, Karen and Donna. His father was a liar and a cheater. All these traits were inherited by his son, John. From a young age, he engaged in fraud and lived by deception. John sold illegal substances and also consumed them. Due to his illegal activities with the police, he was expelled from California. In 1988, he graduated from the University of Arizona with a degree in art and then went to the law school at the University of Dayton. His friends nicknamed him Dirty John because he could seduce any woman. John was a handsome man, just under 190 centimeters tall, with hazel eyes and thick dark hair. He had a charming smile that attracted women. After his studies, John met a woman named Tanya S., who was a practicing anesthetist. John and Tanya married in November 1990. She was 25 and he was 31. A large part of their relationship was built on lies. John never introduced Tanya to his family, claiming they were all bad people. His wife helped him through nursing school in Tennessee, and he obtained an anesthesiology license. They had 2 children together, but after some time, their marriage fell apart. Tanya learned from John's mother and sisters that he had lied about his background. She also discovered John's secret stash of pills, which he had stolen from needy patients and was addicted to, explaining his mood swings. Tanya immediately informed the police. After an investigation, John confessed to everything, but instead of turning himself in, he fled the state and moved into a hotel in Michigan. The police had no trouble finding him. John was found unconscious, surrounded by empty pill bottles. Thus, they called an ambulance, but on the way he came to, grabbed the medication and jumped out of the ambulance. They found and arrested him again and sentenced him in Michigan to 6 years in prison for resisting arrest and possession of illegal substances. However, John only spent 17 months in prison. He found a way to shorten his sentence and was released in 2004. At this time in his life, he met Debra. John was 55 and Debra was 59. She decided to try her luck with online dating, and that's where they found each other. Debra was very impressed with his profile. John wrote that he was a divorced doctor and Christian seeking love. At this point, she had a few terrible dates behind her, but when she met John, he showed such sincere interest in her life and praised her achievements that Debra was pleasantly surprised. Their first date was in October 2014. They went to a restaurant named Houston's in Irvine, California. John's task was to impress Debra. He excitedly told stories from his alleged past, where he had worked for Doctors Without Borders in Iraq, which were completely made up. He said he had 2 children and a few houses. Debra painted the picture of a doctor who had given everything he had to the world. He behaved as if Debra was the most amazing woman in the world, a queen. Exactly the feeling a woman tired of loneliness wanted to feel. Then, the man expressed his desire to meet her family. In his sweet words, Debra's heart stopped. The woman melted from attention and praise, so they ended up in her penthouse right after the restaurant. But here, John went too far and wanted more after a kiss. Debra didn't like being pressured and asked the man to leave. The next morning, John decided to correct his mistake and called Debra. He apologized, saying he had drunk too much and couldn't restrain his feelings. This confession elevated him again in the woman's eyes, and the dates continued. Time passed, their relationship developed, and the couple spent a lot of time together. By the 3rd date, John had confessed his love and proposed to her. They enjoyed each other's company so much that Debra overlooked some odd things, for example, that her boyfriend always appeared in a worn-out and outdated medical uniform. Debra hosted a fashionable charity event to which she invited John, and he came again in his uniform, claiming he simply had no time to change, but she didn't care. She introduced him to her friends and proudly posed in front of the cameras with her doctor. With each day, they grew closer, and eventually, they moved in together. One of Debra's daughters, Jacqueline, lived in the penthouse with her mother. The girl was quite straightforward and very critical of all the men her mother brought home, and she was not afraid to speak her mind. As Debra brought John home more and more often, Jacqueline noticed more and more things she didn't like about him. She said he looked like a homeless loser and was very surprised that her mother, who indulged in Gucci and Chanel, got involved with this guy in a dirty coat. In the penthouse, he looked at all the artworks, statues, and paintings too closely, as if he was appraising their value. John convinced Debra that they should live separately, and a few weeks after their first meeting, they found a house to rent for $6,500 a month on the shore of Balboa Island in Newport. Debra paid several months' rent in advance and spent $80,000 on their move, while John didn't even put his name on the lease agreement, citing some tax issues. The woman was so blinded by love and attention that she was willing to pay for everything herself. Debra did this without her children's knowledge. She didn't understand why her children didn't like John, as he treated her like a queen. Her chosen one prepared fresh coffee for her in the mornings, bought groceries, and tried to make her life easier. Debra was convinced she had hit the jackpot. She convinced herself that her children would adjust over time and they could be a happy family. She decided to introduce John to her younger daughter, Tara, who had a gentler character than Jacqueline. Tara lived with her boyfriend in Las Vegas, and when her mother told her about John on the phone, Tara decided to meet him in person. She arrived just as her mother and her boyfriend were moving into a new house. Tara did not like John from the first meeting. He showed no joy towards her, silently carried things into the house without any help, trying to play the cool guy. But Tara wanted to give him another chance. That wasn't necessary, as Tara immediately noticed alarming signs. John had no car. He claimed to own houses in Newport Beach and Palm Springs, but he never offered to move there or visit them. He spent most of the day at home playing video games. Shortly before Thanksgiving, Tara went through John's things and found a certificate that he was a nurse and understood that he was not a doctor. When John learned of this, he became angry and made a big scandal. He accused Tara of robbing her mother of her happiness, screaming that they could not be separated, while Debra just stood there and listened. Eventually, they had a big fight, and Tara left the house. John used the situation to convince Debra that her children only wanted her fortune and were waiting for her death, hence they didn't want to see her happy. On the eve of Thanksgiving, Debra's mother Arlene came. She was very religious. John played a religious show in front of her, but instead got another scandal. The feast ended in another fiasco. Afterward, Debra sought a psychotherapist who advised her to set boundaries for her children and live her life, which she did. She and John settled on Balboa Island, spent time in restaurants, walked around, and just enjoyed the landscapes. John sometimes behaved like a teenager, took shirtless selfies, and sent them to her, thus bringing her back to her youth. Debra was overjoyed, but she was still concerned about John's wardrobe. Apart from his old nursing uniform, he only had baggy, torn pants and old t-shirts, and Debra wanted her man to look good and fit her lifestyle. According to him, all his good clothes were stolen during a mission in Iraq, so Debra took him shopping and bought him a completely new wardrobe full of designer clothing. In early December, John accompanied Debra on a business trip to Las Vegas. At this point, they had known each other for less than 2 months, but decided to get married anyway. The woman kept this event secret from her children. One day, a strange woman broke into the house of John and Debra. John used the situation to convince Debra that they should enhance their security. Later, he installed a lot of surveillance cameras in the house, which he could control from his phone. He also installed cameras in her office to monitor her. John wanted to have everything under control. Debra eventually started asking questions about his family and his past, but for every question, John had an answer or an excuse. Despite obvious hints, Debra overlooked them. She believed she had found the perfect guy, but her children didn't give up. Jacqueline decided to conduct her own investigation. Since he didn't have his own car, he drove Debra's Tesla. Jacqueline put trackers on the car to track his movements, But the surveillance didn't yield any results. Then, she and Tara hired a private detective. Soon, the detective brought information. They learned that John had filed for bankruptcy, that he had a nursing license but no medical license, and that he had lived in Arizona, Ohio, Indiana, Tennessee, and California. One of the addresses associated with John was the Orange County Jail. When the daughters told their mother about it, Debra replied that even if it were true, her feelings were no less genuine. At the end of March, a letter for John arrived, which Debra received. The letter was from a former prisoner, but she couldn't read it. John rushed over and snatched the envelope from her hands. At first, he screamed and accused his wife of mistrust, but then he explained that it was a pen pal he was morally supporting. Something about this explanation didn't sit right with Debra. The next day, when John was away on business, she decided to rummage through his things. That's when she began to learn a lot about the man she was married to. It turned out that he was actually a former nurse who had become too dependent on painkillers, was arrested, and not only went to jail but also ruined his entire career. Debra also found out that he was a fraudster. She found court records stating that John had previously deceived and stolen from many women he had met online. The search protocol described a search of his storage where the police found a .38 ammunition, a GPS device, syringes, and more. Only now did Debra realize that John was not at all who he pretended to be. He was a very dangerous man, a criminal with a firearm. He had several court restraining orders from several women, and worst of all, he was released from prison on October 8th and met her a few days later. The woman, shocked by the new information, sifted through the documents. Debra was shocked and frightened. Only now did she begin to understand that John could have harmed her or her children. Debra decided to pretend everything was okay for a while. A few days later, when John went to the hospital for back problems, she started to act. Her family helped her move. While they were packing her things, they found more documents belonging to John. These were printouts of online comments about him written by other women who had known John. They described him as a convincing, skilled liar and advised not to let this man into their lives, not to be deceived by his good looks and charming prince character. Now Debra was sure this man was insane. She decided to tell him she was ending the relationship and leaving, but John continued to write messages and begged her to visit him in the hospital, and Debra gave in. She felt guilty for leaving him. In June 2015, John finally convinced her to return to him. He found 1,000 explanations for all the strange things in his possession. He had hidden his past from Debra because he knew such a woman would otherwise not pay any attention to him. John pretended to be a doctor to impress her, and now he pleaded with her to help him clean up and save his life. Debra, still in love, gave him a second chance. They moved together into a new apartment in Irvine. This decision angered her children greatly, so the two kept away from them for a while. It was March 2016. They had been married for a year and 3 months. Debra helped John fight his addiction, but she was burdened by the fact that her entire family hated him, especially Jacqueline, and this hatred was mutual. It got to the point where John forbade Debra to see her daughter. When John found out that Debra was paying for Jacqueline's real estate courses, he called the school and slandered the girl in front of the teachers. He also sent her threatening, indecent messages, saying that her mother wanted nothing to do with her, and threatened that one day he would come and kill Jacqueline. It seemed that John was recovering, but in the process, he became increasingly evil and cruel. In April 2016, Debra reached her limit and filed for divorce. She wanted to end the relationship peacefully, so she began to gradually withdraw money from her bank account to keep it safe. But in her hiding spot, in one of the lower drawers, lay $30,000. When John discovered this money, he said it belonged to him too. The man realized things were heading towards a divorce and began to become aggressive. Debra knew she had to flee. She packed a little makeup and work clothes and moved to Jacqueline's apartment in Irvine. She felt safe there because the building had many surveillance cameras. She tried to obtain a restraining order, but the judge in Orange County denied her request because there was no direct threat. John lived in another state and did nothing. All she could do was end the relationship and just move on. After she left, John moved into one of her houses in Nevada. He continued to call her, but the woman did not pick up the phone. Then he decided to act differently. On June 11th, 2016, Debra came to work with her Jaguar. During the day, the car was stolen from the office parking lot. It was found about a block and a half away, doused with gasoline and set on fire, but there was no fire, only minor damage. Surveillance cameras clearly showed that the car was stolen by John Mihan. This audacity of her ex-husband frightened Debra. Now she knew John was back in town. She called Jacqueline and Tara and warned them. On the evening of August 20th, 2016, Tara came from work and parked in the parking lot. As she got out of the car, John appeared out of nowhere. The man attacked her with a knife and tried to push her back into the car. Tara began to scream loudly to attract attention. The man covered her mouth with his hand, but immediately regretted it. The girl bit him with all her strength. A fight broke out between them in the middle of the street. Tara wore heavy boots. She managed to kick her attacker and knock the knife out of his hand. Then, without hesitation, she grabbed the blade and began to stab John. She delivered 13 stabs, the last one hitting directly in the eye. She trembled. Fortunately, a neighbor saw the girl. She ran over with a towel to wrap the wounds and called the police. But John did not die. When the paramedics arrived, he still had a pulse. In his car, the police found duct tape, zip ties, kitchen knives, and a passport. Everything looked as if he had planned to kidnap Tara and take her out of the city as a hostage. John Mihan was admitted to the hospital and died 4 days later. At that time, he was 57 years old. His body was cremated. There was no funeral. Everyone who knew him hated him. Debra and her children were very traumatized by this situation. The woman needed some time to return to a normal life, but she still struggles with the guilt of having brought a criminal into her family. Debra became very cautious. Now she always carries a stun gun and pepper spray with her to protect herself at all times. She said she would never meet people on the internet again. Rachel Rose Berkheimer was born on January 16, 1984, in Everett, Washington. She grew up in a complete family with her father Bill and mother Denise, who tried to give their 2 daughters the best. Rachel also had an older sister, Megan. She had a special charm and was an attractive, sweet, and friendly girl. From childhood, Rachel participated in various sports competitions and was among the best in this area. From a young age, she dreamed of becoming a veterinarian because she loved animals and always tried to help homeless cats and dogs. Rachel had many friends at school and was so popular that her father Bill even joked about being her personal secretary, as friends would call and leave messages for Rachel. When she was 16 or 17, Rachel attended high school. In just a year and a half, she experienced more than one tragedy, losing 6 of her friends. 1 drowned, another accidentally caught in a firefight, and a 3rd took his own life. These events had a significant impact on the previously cheerful girl, but what troubled Rachel most was the loss of her best friend Corey, who died in a car accident. Rachel and Corey were very close, behaving like siblings, and this grief deeply affected her. The family noticed how much Rachel had changed since the funeral of her best friend. She no longer joked, became less sociable and ambitious, and stopped making plans for the future. Eventually, at the age of 18, Rachel decided to drop out of school and instead befriended dubious people, raising many questions among her friends and relatives. In 2001, Rachel attended a party where she met a man named John Anderson. He was 2 years older than her and a member of a criminal gang. The sweet, well-mannered, and sensible Rachel began communicating with people who were completely opposite, a group of men of different ages who constantly had problems with the law, almost all of them with a criminal record, involving robberies and illegal drugs. Rachel was aware of her new friend's dark deeds, but never involved herself in anything illegal. She fully understood that these new friends were very dangerous, so she did not tell her parents or her sister about them. One day, Rachel's father, Bill, received a phone bill for $140 and was surprised, assuming it was a mistake. However, it later turned out that Rachel had been calling the local prison where her boyfriend, John Anderson, was serving his sentence. Despite being in jail for several months, this did not stop him from maintaining contact with his beloved. They called each other, and Anderson also wrote letters to Rachel, vividly describing his feelings in these letters. As Rachel's relationship with John deepened, her father Bill tried to dissuade her from it, trying to explain that such relationships would not lead to good things in the future. However, the young and naive girl defended John, seeing much good in him, and was confident that she could help him become a better person. Rachel's sister Megan admitted to their parents that she had once noticed that Ray came home with bruises all over her body, possibly inflicted by John. Eventually, Rachel's parents, with Megan's help, tried to bring their youngest daughter to her senses. One evening, the two sisters started a heartfelt conversation. Ray admitted that John was very jealous of her. She visited him on a date in prison, and John smelled her hair and hands, trying to find out if Ray was seeing another man behind his back. In a conversation with her sister, Rachel opened up, broke into tears, and admitted that this relationship was really weighing her down. Consequently, the girl decided to break up with John Anderson and admitted that this guy was dragging her down. The next day, the young girl told John about the breakup, returned to church, and spent more time with her family. One day, the father came out to the porch in the morning and saw his youngest daughter. It was the old Rachel again. She was radiantly happy, and the joy of life returned to the eyes of the 18-year-old. Rachel shared the good news with her father. She had recently met a man named Morris Rivers. He was also 18 years old. The man had grown up with his grandmother. It turned out that he was already a member of a gang that John Anderson also belonged to, but the guy did not like his environment. Meeting Rachel inspired Maurice to do good. They agreed to go back to school together and finish school. The young people also discussed a future without dysfunctional friends. Maurice encouraged Ray to help him get out and recover. The girl gladly agreed. The friendship with Maurice really changed Rachel a lot. The girl felt happy again. It seemed as if everything was falling into place, but this lasted until John Anderson was released. The first meeting between John and Rachel led to the young people making peace. They were back in a relationship, but this time John was dismissive of the girl. They broke up every day, and the next day they seemed to reconcile, but everything went in cycles. Eventually, Rachel announced the breakup to John again, and she also started dating his friend. For John Anderson, this act was equivalent to betrayal. John began to hate his ex. He constantly told his friends bad things about her, accusing Rachel of allegedly revealing the secrets of their gang to other people. Over time, most of the gang members also became suspicious of her. On September 23, 2022, Rachel Bruckheimer was invited to a party. In fact, it was an ordinary gang meeting in one of the houses where young people simply drank and played video games. Rachel was very glad that she was invited. She intended to prove herself that evening. Recently, the girl felt that her friends were treating her badly. Ray wanted to prove to the guys that she had done nothing wrong to them and had remained loyal to their friendship. Around 3 p.m., Rachel entered the house with her boyfriend Maurice, where the guys had previously been invited. The whole company was in the house. The guys were relaxing, joking around and drinking. For about an hour, Rachel had fun with Maurice and other gang members until John Anderson stormed into the room. The obviously drunk young man began to shout and tried to start a fight. He first hit one friend, then another. Then John pulled out a gun, and all those present realized that the guy had lost control. There was tension in the air. Rachel froze with fear. The girl knew John very well and knew how dangerous he was, so she tried to sneak unnoticed to the door. John immediately realized that Rachel was trying to escape. He grabbed his ex by the hair and threw her to the ground. Suddenly, Rachel heard the command, "Hit her!" The girl felt that literally everyone in the room was being attacked and began to kick her. One of the men even suggested turning up the radio to drown out the screams of the unfortunate victim. It turned out that it was a trap from the beginning. This party was carefully planned by John Anderson. The guy planned this attack even while in prison when Ray stopped answering his calls and letters. That made Anderson really angry. He persuaded his friend Maurice Rivers to ingratiate himself with his girlfriend. John instructed Maurice to befriend Rachel to influence his ex through a friend. Rachel trusted Maurice completely and considered him her friend. so the girl was not afraid to be in bad company where her ex was. It turned out that all the guys had been friends for a long time. Maurice had even been in a cell with Anderson for a while. Maurice was also friends with Nathan, one of the gang members, in school, and was the ward of the 32-year-old Yusuf Jihad, who turned out to be the owner of the house. Yusuf was also the leader of the entire criminal group. In addition to these people, there were also the 22-year-old Jeffrey Bart and the 20-year-old in the house. In total, there were also 8 men in the house, and they all beat Rachel as she pleaded for mercy. After the gang finished beating the victim, the young men tied her legs and arms and covered her mouth with duct tape so that none of the neighbors could hear the girl's screams. Then the young men carried Rachel, tied up, into the garage. The fact is that the criminals did not know what to do next. The plan was implemented, and now it was necessary to develop further measures. Rachel lay tied up in the garage for about 5 hours. All this time, the criminals continued to drink, had fun, and thought about what to do with their friend. Someone suggested demanding a ransom for Rachel, claiming that her father had money and would definitely want to save his beloved daughter. Someone suggested a gang rape, but each version turned out to be unsuccessful. The gang members could not agree on a common opinion, and therefore continued to discuss the future fate of their friend relaxedly. At 9 p.m., a girl entered the garage. It was Yusuf's girlfriend, Trissa Connor. She had just returned home and found Rachel tied up in the garage. Trissa sneaked into the house. She greeted everyone and pretended she didn't know that someone was tied up in the garage. Trissa went to the kitchen, took a knife, and went through the back door. The girl ran into the garage and tried to free the tied-up Rachel, but it turned out that some of the men had followed her. Several men also entered the garage and saw how Trissa was trying to free her captive. Trissa started shouting at her girlfriends. She demanded that they take Rachel away from here right away. Just get her out of the house, otherwise the girl threatened to call the police. The guys obeyed. While part of the gang continued to relax in the house, other young men took a black sports bag, put Rachel in it, closed the zipper, stored the bag in the trunk, and drove off. The criminals drove aimlessly through the city, trying to decide what to do with their friend who was tied up in the trunk. Someone suggested that Rachel might have already learned her lesson, claiming she would no longer reveal the gang's secrets to strangers and should be released. They considered getting a hotel room to wait until Rachel's wounds from the beating healed and then simply letting her go. However, that did not happen. Eventually, the gang realized that John Anderson, who had been the instigator of the entire plot from the beginning, was not there, and it was John who needed to decide what should happen to Rachel and what her future would be. Around 11 p.m., the young men parked near a mountain path. They took the bag with Rachel out of the car and left Maurice to guard the victim while they went into the house to fetch John Anderson. While Maurice and Rachel were alone, a conversation took place between them. Maurice opened the zipper of the bag, sat next to her, and began to reassure his friend. He told her that her parents would pay as much money as necessary. Ray felt in trouble and feared that they intended to do something terrible to her. She pleaded with Maurice not to let her drown. Maurice sat nearby, waiting for the rest of the gang. The conversation lasted several minutes, then Maurice zipped up his bag and walked away from her. He sat down nearby and began waiting for his friends. Meanwhile, the car drove up to the house where the party was held. The young men called John Anderson, the guy who had been smoking a cigarette, went into the garage. He took several shovels and a pickaxe, got into the car, and the young men drove back towards the mountain path. When everyone arrived, John Anderson and John Whitaker began digging a hole. Maurice stayed near the car, and Anderson got annoyed why Rivas wasn't helping them dig. At some point, Rachel began to cry and noises were heard from the bag. Angry, John Anderson approached his ex-girlfriend and hit her as hard as he could with a shovel to silence her. After some time, Anderson opened the bag, freed Ray, and ordered John Whitaker to strip his ex. But Rachel said no, she would strip off all her clothes herself. Along with her belongings, Rachel was instructed to also lay down all her jewelry. The girl begged to keep the ring on her finger, a gift from her best friend who had died in a car accident. If she had to die, she wanted to die with her dear gift, but John did not allow her to do so. Rachel obeyed the order and removed her jewelry. Afterward, the girl fell to the ground and began to pray. John looked at his ex sarcastically and commented that it was unnecessary because she would be there soon anyway. John Anderson ordered Rachel Rose to lie face down in the grave he had personally dug for her. Rachel did exactly that and did not stop praying. Anderson pulled out a gun and began shooting Rachel Rose Berkheimer in the head and back. After the entire loaded arsenal had been emptied, the girl was cynically buried. On the way home, the young men swore an oath to each other that none of those present had the right to tell anyone about the events that had just happened. Otherwise, the one who betrayed them would end up in the unfortunate Rachel's place. Anderson disposed of the weapon by throwing it into a nearby pond. The young men put the deceased girl's clothes and jewelry into a pillowcase and planned to burn them. 2 days later, Bill and Denise began to worry about their daughter. Previously, the girl could afford to stay away from home for several days but always stayed in contact with them, which was not the case this time. The next morning, the parents of the missing girl contacted the police. Officers immediately organized a search for the missing person. Posters about Rachel's disappearance were hung all over the city and were also reported on local television. Just a day later, interesting information surfaced. The mother of one of the gang members, 22-year-old Geoffrey BTO, called the police. The woman knew very well that Rachel was friends with her son and his friends. She said that the boys often drove Matthew Dorham's Jeep, and perhaps information about the Jeep would help the investigation find the missing girl. The 17-year-old Matthew Dorham was immediately called in for questioning. They did not mince words with the guy. Matthew was told that his penalty for denunciation would be significantly reduced if he confessed there and then where the 18-year-old Rachel was located. Matthew was able to tell the police the whole truth anonymously, quietly, and without publicity. In return, the guy was promised leniency. A sincere confession and help in solving the case would help him avoid severe penalties, and Matthew confessed everything. The teenager snitched on all his friends. The 17-year-old young man described in detail each action of every gang member against Rachel Rose and what role each individual played in the terrible murder. Since it was already dark that day, Matthew showed the approximate burial site of the victim. With the help of dogs, they were able to locate Rachel's grave. The girl was found with her hands folded in the hole because she had not stopped praying until the last second. When the police arrived at Yusuf's house with a search warrant, they also found a pillowcase with the victim's belongings. They attempted to burn personal items, but they were not completely successful. Everything Matthew had said at the police station turned out to match the reality. All 8 gang members involved in Rachel's murder were arrested that same day. 5 of the 8 men made a deal. They confessed their guilt to have the possibility of a shorter sentence. The 16-year-old Nathan was charged with conspiracy and aiding and abetting a crime. Since he was not involved in the murder, he only spent 30 days in jail. The 20-year-old Tony, who had beaten Rachel and taped her mouth, also turned on the radio to drown out the victim's screams, was sentenced to several years in prison. The 22-year-old Jeffrey, whose mother had called the police, drove the car with the girl tied up in the trunk and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. The 17-year-old Matthew, who also drove the car, was sentenced to 26 years in prison. The 18-year-old Maurice, who was directly involved in the conspiracy against Rachel, was sentenced to 26 years in prison. The 32-year-old Yusuf, the owner of the house where everything began, was sentenced to 37 years in prison. The 22-year-old John Whitaker was found guilty on all charges. The man was facing the death penalty, but since he confessed his guilt and cooperated with the police, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. The 20-year-old John Anderson, who planned revenge against his ex-girlfriend, behaved shockingly in court. The guy constantly smiled at the cameras and sometimes even laughed demonstratively, but the worst part was that he winked at Rachel's family. John Anderson was also facing the death penalty, but since the man fully confessed his guilt, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. This tragic case closed with the judicial system dealing harshly with those responsible, hoping to deliver a measure of justice for the horrific acts committed against Rachel Rose Berkheimer. Her community and family, while forever marked by the loss, sought to find peace in the wake of such profound tragedy.